Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent that the cloture motion with respect to the motion to proceed to H.R. 1968 be withdrawn. The motion to proceed to H.R. 1968 be agreed to. Further, that if cloture is filed on H.R. 1968, the Senate immediately vote on the motion to invoke cloture. And if cloture is invoked, the only amendments in order to H.R. 1968 be the following: Merkley, number 1273, Duckworth, number 1274, Van Hollen, number 1272, and Paul, number 1266. That the Senate vote on adoption of the amendments in the order listed with 60 affirmative votes required for adoption, with the exception of the Paul amendment, that there be 2 minutes for debate equally divided prior to each vote. Further, that upon disposition of the Paul amendment, all post-cloture time be expired. The bill be considered, read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill as amended, if amended, all without further intervening action or debate. Further, that following disposition of H.R. 1968, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S. 1077, that there be up to 10 minutes for a debate on the bill equally divided between the two leaders or their designees, that upon the use or yielding back of time, the bill be considered, read a third time, the Senate vote on passage with no amendments or motions to order the bill, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. Finally, following disposition of S. 1077, and notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate resume executive session and vote on the motion to invoke cloture on Phelan nomination, and if cloture is invoked on the Phelan nomination, all post-cloture time be expired. The Senate immediately vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the Landau nomination, and if cloture is invoked on the Landau nomination, all post-cloture time be expired. The Senate vote on confirmation of the nominations at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader in consultation with the Democratic Leader no earlier than Monday, March 24th.
Is there objection? Without objection. Under previous order, the clerk will report the bill.
Calendar number 26, H.R. 1968, an act making further continuing appropriations and so forth and for other purposes.
The Democratic Leader.
Mr. President, before we finish today, I would like to say that soon the Senate will vote on a bipartisan piece of legislation that will make an important D.C. funding fix. This legislation will make sure that we take care of the residents of the district. It will support law enforcement and firefighters and teachers and city services. The legislation is very good news for the residents of the District of Columbia. I'm happy we're passing the bill today. I thank my colleagues for working quickly to bring this bill to the floor. Once the Senate acts, we urge the House to act quickly. Now, government funding expires at midnight tonight, and the votes before us is a Hobson choice. The CR bill is a bad bill. But as bad as the CR is, I believe that allowing Donald Trump to take even more power via a government shutdown is a far worse option. A shutdown would allow DOJ to shift into overdrive. It would give Donald Trump and DOJ the keys to the city, the state, and country. And that is a far worse alternative. Now, I want to remind everyone that it was Republicans who pushed this false shutdown choice. Their inability to govern has led us to this precipice. Our caucus members have two bad choices. Different senators will come down on different sides of the question, but that does not mean that any Senate Democrat supports a shutdown. Whatever the outcome, our caucus will be united in our determination to continue the long-term fight to stop Donald Trump's dangerous war on our democracy and on America's working families. And now I want to be clear about what this bill does and does not do. The full-year CR is a law that sets funding levels for the full year, and the President and executive branch have a legal and constitutional duty to faithfully execute the CR. The CR does not change the underlying law, making the Trump administration's impoundments and mass firings illegal. This is true as a matter of law. Nothing in the CR changes the Impoundment Control Act, the foundation of Congress's appropriations authority, and the authorization laws that require USAID and other agencies to exist and to operate the programs Congress has assigned to them. Nothing changes Title V, governing the civil service, the Administrative Procedure Act, and so on. One of the reasons I'm voting for cloture is for the very reason that these actions are illegal and no new law is needed to declare that. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk for calendar number 26, H.R. 1968.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on calendar number 26, H.R. 1968, an act making further continuing appropriations and other extensions for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2025, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
And I ask consent that the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, for all the information of all senators, there will be up to 9 roll call votes. And I will ask unanimous consent that all votes following the first vote be 10 minutes in length, and that if senators will stay in their seats, we should be able to get them done even more quickly than that. So everybody be here after this first vote. These are going to be 10-minute votes.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on calendar number 26, H.R. 1968, an act making further continuing appropriations and other extensions for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2025, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on H.R. 1968, an act making further continuing appropriations and other extensions for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2025, and for other purposes shall be brought to a close? The yeas and the nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins. I got you. Thank you. Mr. Schumer, I did get you. Thank you. The Democratic leader. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Thank you. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran. Mr. Marino. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bozeman, Britt, Collins, Cornyn, Crapo, Durbin, Ernst, Graham, King, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Mullen, Ricketts, Schatz, Schumer, Sheehy, Thune, and Tillis. Senators voting in the negative: Cantwell, Duckworth, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, Murray, Ossoff, and Paul. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Padilla, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Gallego, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Marino, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Thank you. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Fetterman, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Welch, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Slatkin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Okay. Mr. Blumenthal, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 62, the nays are 38. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn have voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, we've already locked in 10-minute votes.
Majority Leader.
We've already locked in 10-minute votes for the balance of the number of votes, but if people stay here in their seats, we can execute that a lot more quickly.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment 1273 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Oregon, Mr. Merkley proposes an amendment number 1273.
There will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
Colleagues, let me keep this very simple. We provided a lot of funding in the Inflation Reduction Act so that those who have very sophisticated finances and very powerful advisors that try to avoid ever paying their taxes don't get away with it, because it's a fundamental fairness all across America. Ordinary working people have the money taken out of their paychecks every week. Just because people have enormous paychecks and fancy consultants shouldn't be that they get licensed to cheat. And all of that money went to make sure that those upper income folks knew that somebody might be taking a look at their finances. If this amendment fails, it will increase the deficit by $46 billion. So I hope all of you who are fiscally responsible and care about fundamental fairness to workers across America will vote for this amendment.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, this isn't about saving $46 billion. It's about spending $46 billion. It's about saving $20 billion. The Democrats' partisan, supersized IRS funding is something we've been battling over for a couple of years now. It's a textbook example of the type of out-of-control spending that President Trump and Republicans have rightly opposed. Rather than working together to help the IRS solve its massive taxpayer service and IT shortcomings, the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act went to fund untargeted and heavily handed enforcement improvement. As I mentioned at the time, the last thing hardworking Americans need is an IRS funding bloat that disproportionately hurts them. I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment to provide the IRS nearly 2 times its entire annual budget in unaccountable enforcement dollars.
A sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick.
No.
Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Resch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative. Senators voting in the affirmative. Also Brooks, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt-Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Padilla, Peters, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Shaheen, Smith, Van Hollen, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative. Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Hall, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, Young. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Gallego? Aye. Mr. Kane? Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto? Aye. Mr. Ossoff? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Ms. Slotkin? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Hoven? No. Ms. Baldwin? Aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 47, the nays are 53. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. Order. Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment 1274 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Illinois, Ms. Duckworth, proposes an amendment number 1274.
Mr.
There will
President,
now be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided.
Mr. President, what Trump and Musk have done to our veterans in just 8 weeks since Trump has been back in office amounts to a total betrayal. He's already fired more veterans than any other president in modern history, 6,000 and counting, for no apparent reason, forcing the bravest people you or I could ever meet to have to worry about how they're going to put food on their family's table next week or keep a roof over their heads next month. These are folks who did 1, 2, 6, 7 tours, then came home and chose to continue serving their nation by joining federal service. These are heroes who deserve our utmost gratitude. Instead, Trump and Musk are giving them the middle finger. Cadet Bonesburgs may like to wrap himself in the flag with one hand, but with the other, he's signing off on the orders that sell out our veterans to line billionaires' pockets, and our warriors deserve better. That is one reason why I'm urging my colleagues to vote yes on my Protect Veterans Jobs Act, a simple amendment that would reinstate every veteran who's been fired because of Trump and Musk betrayal. If Republicans actually care about our veterans like they claim to on Fox News,
The senator's time has
then they will
expired.
vote yes on this bill and help give our veterans their jobs back. Otherwise, they're making it clear that they would rather bow down at the altar of
senator's
Donald
time has
Trump
expired.
than stand up for our heroes.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, where was the Democrat outrage when 8,000 active duty and reserve troops were unceremoniously and with no due process fired out of the military without benefits? Where was the outrage when thousands of first responders, police officers, firefighters, nurses, and doctors lost their employment because they had COVID vaccine hesitancy? There was no outrage. There was no call of betrayal under President Biden when all that happened. The truth is this bill is pro-veteran. It adds $6 billion to our veteran spending. It has the largest pay increase for our war fighters in a generation. This is a pro-veteran bill. Let's stop using veterans as political pawns and keep the government funded. I yield.
Order. The question is on the amendment. Is there a second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
No worries.
Ms. Baldwin.
Just vote.
Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Thank you. Gotcha. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Senator. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Marino. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Thanks. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. I did, thanks. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch. I mean, yes, I did, yeah. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt-Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, and Whitehouse. Mr. Schatz, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Marino, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Keynes, aye. It does.
On this vote, the yeas are 47, the nays are 53. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, together with my Maryland and Virginia Senate colleagues, I call up my amendment 1272 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen, for himself and others, proposes an amendment number 1272.
Mr. President, this amendment shuts down the illegal Musk-Doge operation, which has nothing to do with government efficiency and everything. Could I have order, please, Mr. President?
Order.
Thank you, Mr. President. This amendment shuts down the illegal Elon Musk operation, which has nothing to do with government efficiency and everything to do with rigging the government for people like Elon Musk and powerful special interests. That's why they started by firing all the independent inspector generals in the U.S. government, which just opens the door to more corruption. And they have lied and lied to the American people. They illegally fired over 200,000 patriotic federal employees, including 6,000 veterans, and added insult to injury by lying that they were fired for poor performance. That was untrue, and this is why judges are ordering the Trump administration to return them to their jobs. They gained access illegally to highly sensitive personal information on Americans, and just today we learned—
The senator's time has expired.
I asked unanimous consent for 10 seconds. Thank you, Mr. President. And finally—
No objection.
They also have essentially tried to clear the way for tax cuts for very wealthy Americans, and I will end with this. They've also lied about their savings.
Senator,
I say,
your time's expired.
Time to delete Doge. Please adopt the amendment. Thank you, my colleagues.
Mr. President. Senator
from Iowa.
Mr. President, since January, Doge has saved $115 billion. That amounts to—
Order.
Please. That amounts to $714 per taxpayer. Some of Doge's findings—
Order.
Some of Doge's findings include the Small Business Administration gave out more than $300 million in loans to thousands of children 11 years and younger. Agencies were paying for tens of thousands of unused software licenses, and the Department of Veterans Affairs was paying $56,000 to water 8 plants for 5 years. Thanks to Doge, that contract was canceled. Now the plants will actually be watered for free. While Doge keeps delivering more savings every day, Democrats are more upset by the effort to stop wasteful spending than by the misuse of tax dollars. As I always say, if you can't find waste in Washington, you are not
The senator's time has
looking.
expired.
I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. We can't afford more Washington business as usual that gave us $36 trillion of debt.
Senator's time has expired.
I yield.
The question is on the amendment. Time has expired. Senator, your time's expired. The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kim, King, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Welch, Whitehouse. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hawley, Hoban, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Hall, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker. Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Young, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 48 and the nays are 52. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
Order. The Senator from Kentucky.
I call up my amendment 1266 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The Senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment number 1266.
Order in the chamber. Senator from Kentucky.
I compliment President Trump and DOJ for exposing waste and abuse in foreign aid spending. It boggles the mind to think that some in Congress defend spending $2 million on sex changes in Guatemala, thousands on an LGBT opera in Colombia, and thousands on a trans comic book in Peru. This is the low-hanging fruit. If Congress can't vote to cut this egregious, crazy, left-wing lunacy, will Congress ever have the courage to tackle entitlements? Yet there does remain a significant constitutional question as to whether these cuts need a congressional vote to give them permanence. Today, with my amendment, Congress can make these foreign aid cuts the law.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, the senator's amendment would indiscriminately cut $16 billion from state and USAID, including life-saving assistance Secretary Rubio said he wants to maintain for the purchase of food from American farmers, programs to counter the PRC influence, and efforts to ensure American businesses are more competitive overseas. This amendment would cut funding for the USAID Inspector General by 83%, making any waste, fraud, or abuse hard to uncover. And it would gut global health programs like Trump, Rubio, and Musk say they allegedly want to preserve. Not even House Republicans went this far. This amendment would undermine American workers, American businesses, and our national security. I urge a no vote.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Who said no? Wicker? Oh, okay, it was. Gotcha. Thank you. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. That was Klobuchar. Okay. I got you. Thank you. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Marino. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Blackburn, Cornyn, Cotton, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Haggerty, Hawley, Johnson, Justice, Lee, Lummis, Moody, Paul, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, and Tuberville. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Bozeman, Cantwell, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Crapo, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Fisher, Gallego, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Hyde-Smith, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Langford, Lujan, Markey, McConnell, McCormick, Merkley, Moran, Mullen, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Ricketts, Rosen, Rounds, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Thune, Tillis, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Welch, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Budd, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Marino, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Budd, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 27, the nays are 73. The amendment is not agreed to. Okay. Under the previous order, the bill is considered read a third time. The question occurs on passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also-Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock,
Those New Yorkers are fast talkers.
Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Justice, Kennedy, King, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Shaheen, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kim, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Hall, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Warnock, no.
The yeas are 54, the nays are 46. The bill is passed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table.
Do you want to go first? Or? Yes. Okay. So.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of S1077, which the clerk will report.
S1077, a bill to approve local funds for the District of Columbia for fiscal year 2025 and so forth.
President.
There will now be up to 10 minutes of debate, equally divided. The senator from Maine is recognized.
Thank you. Madam President, I'm pleased to introduce this bill with Senators Van Hollen, Murray, Alsobrooks, Warner, and Kane. It has been endorsed by President Trump and also by the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, Tom Cole. This bill would simply fix a mistake in... Madam President, could I have order, please? Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, this bill would simply fix a mistake in the House CR that prevents the District of Columbia from spending its own tax dollars as part of its budget, which Congress routinely approves. Congress approves the authorization of the expenditure of D.C. local funds, which are paid for by D.C. tax revenues. The first CR that we enacted last year included language to approve the D.C.'s FY25 budget, and that language was continued in the second CR. However, the House did not extend this anomaly in the year-long CR. As a result, unless this bill is passed, D.C. would have to operate under its fiscal year 24 budget for the remainder of 25, potentially requiring $1.1 billion in local spending cuts. Reducing D.C.'s local funding expenditures will not result in a dollar of federal savings. Since October 1st of 2024, the district has been operating under and spending at its approved level for the fiscal year 25 budget. According to the CBO, this bill does not have any budgetary costs to the federal government. There are no federal dollars involved. The issue here is just allowing the D.C. government to proceed to spend its own tax revenues. Accordingly, I urge all of my colleagues to support this measure to correct a true inequity. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President, I want to thank Senator Collins for working on an emergency basis to fix this problem in the House bill. She said it well, so I only want to emphasize 2 points. One, what the House did does not save the federal taxpayer one penny, not one penny. What it does is cap what the District of Columbia can spend using its own money and based on its own decisions. So taxpayers are not saved a dime by what they did nor will they gain by our fix. And the people of the District of Columbia should be able to make these decisions. And if they're having to make a budget with $1 billion less, it will mean less police forces, less firefighters, and less money for schools. So I want to thank the senator from Maine for working with us on this, and pleased to be joined by my colleagues from Virginia and Maryland, Senator Warner, Senator Alsobrooks, and Senator Kane. We urge its adoption unanimously.
Virginia.
Madam President, I also want to thank my dear friend from Maine. She's moving back up much higher on all of our lists, for being willing to step up and help correct this. You know, we all want, as the President wants our nation's capital to be the safest, cleanest, most welcoming city. D.C. gets 26 million tourists every year. In 2026, when we're going to celebrate 250 years, we want to show off D.C. and the whole region. If we allowed this mistake to take place, D.C. will lay off cops, it'll close schools, it'll shut down on trash removal. For those of us in the region who use Metro, dramatic cutbacks. Let's correct this mistake. Let's make sure that we show on our 250th anniversary the cleanest, safest city in America, and this will be a giant step for that.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
I, too, want to thank Senator Collins, Van Hollen, Warner, and Kane, and I'm glad that we could work together in this bipartisan way to ensure fairness for the residents of Washington, D.C. I rise today to speak for the over 700,000 D.C. residents who do not have representation in this body. They are our friends and our neighbors. Beyond those who work in D.C., Maryland partners with D.C. on resources like emergency services, police, water, and more. And this bipartisan standalone bill ensures that D.C. tax dollars stay in D.C. Again, these funds that have been cut are tax dollars that have literally already been paid by D.C. residents. And all this bill does is to continue to ensure that D.C. receives what it is owed. So I urged all of my colleagues today to join me in voting yes. Thank you.
Senator from Virginia.
Madam President, I can make it fast or slow. I'm joining all these colleagues to advocate for this bill. 1/3 of the Virginia population is residents of the D.C. metro area and enjoy this capital, and 150,000 Virginians come to work in D.C. every day, and they want D.C. police and services to be well funded. Please support this bill. Thank you.
Under the previous order, the bill is considered read a third time. The question occurs on passage of the bill. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The bill is passed.